Hey folks, my name is Spencer. This is YuYu. Welcome back to the half hour with the worst intro I've come up with so far in this entire series. Today we're going to be talking about we're going to talk about a campaign strategy that's been happening, which is good old Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and seeing how his campaign has been struggling. And this is going to be probably a flurry of, probably throughout the next year, we'll be talking a lot about campaign strategies. So this is a great episode to start understanding like what paths that campaigns are about to go on, what will cause campaigns to be successful, and what causes campaigns to fail. So I'm pretty stoked about this because this is one of my favorite areas of what I studied in college, and we get to talk about the hypotheticals. Hi, YuYu. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. And on your note about like the worst introduction we've had this episode, I feel like I don't know. Like I watched back our two episodes and I'm like, dang, I sound so awkward and like tired. I'm so sorry, y'all. I'm like tired 24/7 now as like a junior in college, but I try, like I think we both try to introduce this episode in fun, quirky ways. But I don't know. I don't hate Hey Folks. Hey Folks is good.
It's just, hey folks, my name is Spencer. That's YuYu. What a great intro!
Okay.
Like you don't know who our names are already.
People aren't listening for our introductions. People are listening for the content. So, um, there's that. But then again, I guess we are like a speech and debate podcast, so we should probably worry about presentation too. I don't know.
You know what?
Um,
You know what's funny? I actually think this intro has turned into something really good after it derailed from my intro.
yeah, okay. Yeah. Anyway, DeSantis, presidential election next year. Fun, exciting, quirky. Yeah, I think there's a lot to talk about with the presidential elections, and especially like who's gonna be the Republican candidate, and also like surprisingly enough, like who's gonna be the Democratic candidate as well. I think that answer is like a little bit more obvious, but for this episode, because the incumbent is President Biden, we want to talk about DeSantis and to see where the Republican candidacies are.
Yeah, and it's definitely been interesting when we're talking about DeSantis's campaign because the strategy has been abysmal. Like that's the easiest way to put it. And what we've seen over time with how he's been going about his campaign, it's really not working. And there can be several reasons for that. Going from policies that he's been making in Florida as of late towards just his general campaign strategy. It sounded like on paper a few years ago, or probably last year, that he was a strong candidate for the Republican nomination. But now, YuYu, I don't think so as much. He's really losing a ton of ground.
Yeah, for sure. I think that like there are candidates that are catching up and people, that are very weary already of DeSantis and not necessarily sure which candidate they're going to pick are trying to pick sides right now as the election season's coming up pretty soon. And yeah, I don't know. We have a lot to talk about. I know that you like have mentioned DeSantis being a really good candidate, so fun to see you do more analysis on it now.
Yeah, as things have gone on, my perspective has actually changed quite a bit. I had a We'll actually just jump into my background because I think I mentioned this in my background here. So, without any further delay, let's do this. Because in a previous episode, I did make a claim that I think DeSantis had more than likely the chance of being the GOP nomination for president. Now, at this point in time, I believe this is to probably be unlikely. My argument for the time was that the Florida governor was trending in the direction that was likely going to gain ground for the direction of the party. It has gotten more conservative. And truthfully, this statement is right. Both parties in the US are trending further right and further left. And over time, what we see is the voters also end up going further right and further left, which would make it for a very fair argument that DeSantis was in line. The problem is that DeSantis might have gone too far to the right. And we can see a lot of that based off of his policies that he's enacted in Florida and a lot of the changes that he's trying to pass, especially regarding critical race theory and education, that parents are becoming more concerned about and are not looking great for him in terms of the polling. However, we're really looking at his campaign in this episode, and I want to focus a lot about what's happened with his campaign. And his focus on his campaign has been internet first, specifically through social media. In years past, social media has driven the success of the Republican Party. It was one of the reasons as to why the Trump campaign was successful in 2016, and was the first indication of how social media can be used to win elections. The problem is DeSantis's advisors have struggled with DeSantis's campaign strategy of freedom, which in itself is pretty vague. How do you define freedom? Most guests that attended DeSantis's meetings at this point did not know if the campaign knew exactly where it was going. You can't really describe a campaign of freedom relatively easily to an audience that doesn't know who they're going to vote for in a primary. Freedom is in fact vague and doesn't give us enough information about what your campaign is actually going to do. So the DeSantis campaign has really struggled with the direction of what freedom means to its people. And because of this, the campaign has faced itself with several massive errors, including gaffes, unforced errors, and blown opportunities. Added to this, the DeSantis campaign has failed to make successful attacks against the former president, and instead has only turned into fueling the fire more for the Trump campaign. So it seems as if whenever DeSantis decides, hey, we're going to make an attack against former President Trump, that former President Trump only gains more ground. And the failure of his virtual campaign is one of the biggest indicators of why DeSantis' campaign has been struggling. Yet, DeSantis has also reorganized and laid off several staff members that were working to help his campaign, which adds to the fact that something in the DeSantis campaign is continuing to struggle. If you're laying off some of your top campaign advisors, let's start talking about how successful your campaign really is. And in terms of funding for his campaign, which arguably means nothing, because technically speaking, funding really doesn't win a lot of elections. Like, having a good amount of funding is key to advertising and marketing towards people. But in the past, we've noted that funding is not the key factor to winning an election. But something that's really important to add, when we're looking at funding for his campaign, DeSantis continues to earn campaign money mainly from his home state, Florida, which means that he's not earning enough money from across the country, and it's only focused and isolated in 1 out of 50 states, which, as you could probably guess, is not really helpful when you're trying to win a country over. And this is coming mainly from lobbyists and longtime supporters of Governor DeSantis. And even worse for DeSantis, he can only use a third of the $15 million raised from Florida for GOP primary efforts. At this point in time, DeSantis needs to hope that the primary elections in Iowa will limit the field down only to 2, which is Trump and DeSantis. And at this point, if it comes down to Trump and DeSantis may actually hold a chance to win the nomination. But I would argue that he's probably not in that field at the moment, YuYu. And he's really struggling to gain ground on President Trump, and if anything, knocking his opponents out of the field.
Yeah, I think it's been a really rocky journey, especially for DeSantis, but also for other Republican presidential candidates that are trying to run against former President Trump, just because it does seem like Trumpism is on the rise still, and people still have very like strong opinions about former President Trump being the president of 2024. And if there is going to be a red wave, it does seem like Trump would be the likely candidate. And so it does pose like really interesting questions to see all of these other candidates like vying for this position and vying for the spot, especially like looking at what's going on in Iowa, which is a little bit about what I'm going to talk about in my background. I think like taking a better look at DeSantis's competition outside of Trump can give us a better sense of how DeSantis is holding up, if he is at all. And this isn't to say that his campaign has had no success. It has had success, and people are like buying more onto, I don't know, like riding the DeSantis train, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he is going to be the candidate or he is going to beat out Trump, especially when there are other candidates that we can consider. Um, so there are a host of candidates, I should say that, but something that y'all should keep in mind and really, really take a look at is that Mike Pence has now dropped out of the Republican presidential nomination. So if you don't know, which you probably don't, because it was like 2016 and a long time ago, and most of y'all did not start school or did not start high school in like 2016. But Mike Pence was former President Trump's VP for a long time, like a whole during his whole presidency. But after his presidency, like Mike Pence and Trump kind of had a falling off, and they were no longer on the same train anymore. And so Mike Pence had actually ran against Trump again in the 2024 elections. But he's recently dropped out, citing mainly that, the Republican Party just isn't what he imagined it's going to be, and also that it's not his time to shine. And it's not directly quoted, but it is very similar to the verbiage that he uses to describe why he wanted to drop out of the presidential bid. So, with that being said, though, who's still running? I will say there's probably enough content to fill another episode. So, instead of just giving you a list of names, I'm going to tell you to check out the Atlantic's cheat sheet to the 2024 presidential race, which I will say is very much a cheat sheet. Only provides a gist of information and definitely not all of the information. And the candidates that are on that list are not accurate representations all of the time of what is going on. But if you do want to know who was in the running, even on the Democratic side, taking a look at that cheat sheet would be really good just to have a general information on who these candidates are. But the person I do want to focus on is Nikki Haley. So, because we're focusing on DeSantis and because we're focusing on this election against Donald Trump to be the Republican candidate for president, Nikki Haley has been someone who poses a significant threat. And both DeSantis's campaign, whether they admit it out loud in the media or not, and Trump's campaign have taken a notice to how Nikki Haley's campaign has like increasingly grown in popularity and has started to pose a threat to DeSantis's position as the anti-Trump candidate. So, for example, she's been doing better in some of the polls. For example, trailing behind DeSantis's numbers in Iowa and also in New Hampshire. There has been like kind of like a little bit of a panic from DeSantis' side, I think, from looking at these increasing poll numbers and looking at her popularity. I should be clear that both Haley and DeSantis still trail behind Trump in poll numbers. I think what I've read is like it's like 40 to 50 points behind, which is a significant margin. So that's something to keep in mind. However, what we are really looking at and analyzing is these two candidates in comparison with each other as the anti-Trump candidate for the final, who's going to be the Republican candidate for 2024. It's also good to note that these numbers are about the primary elections, so i.e. like what's going to determine the presidential candidates for 2024 for both Republicans and Democrats. So we're talking about like caucus votes, and we're talking about like who is going to represent our party votes, not who is going to be president votes. But those often are not like reflect who is going to be president votes later on. But right now, we're still focused on like who's going to be the candidate. So Iowa is an important state to look at since it is the state that votes first followed by New Hampshire, Nevada, and then South Carolina. It does seem like Democrats are focusing more on South Carolina or just somewhere that's other than Iowa, while Republican candidates are focusing on Iowa. Um, so the reason why Iowa has been super important and why you probably read like, oh, here are their numbers in Iowa. DeSantis is staking its numbers higher in Iowa, or like people are putting all their eggs in one basket in Iowa is because like since it is the first state to vote and since you get to know what the results are first from that state, it helps boost whoever won that state elections into the next states. So into New Hampshire, into Nevada, into South Carolina, etc. And so if you have that boost there, it's really important for the rest of your campaign in order to win that bid, period. So that's why people are looking at Iowa for the most part. So, why is DeSantis losing momentum? Well, along with Spencer's analysis, candidates like Nikki Haley appeal to voters that are looking for someone who isn't Trump because her campaign has been consistent and has recently received more attention than usual, both positive and negative attention. Although her campaign managers would say that her negative attention is the reason why she's becoming more popular. And that is also something to keep in mind. However, Trump has been the favorite in many states for the Republican candidate, especially in Iowa, despite not showing up to the first debates. Some of his quotes in response to DeSantis's criticism of Trump not showing up to the first presidential debate for the Republican candidacy was that, well, why would I show up when I'm leading so far in the polls, which really shows you the type of attitude and also the results of the polls in the first place for who is going to be what. So his team, by that DeSantis's team and the PACs that have been, or sorry, his team as in Trump's team and the PACs that have been supporting Trump's team has been taunting DeSantis and Haley's campaign over and over. So between DeSantis and Trump, I feel like there's almost a battle of the PACs low key where they've been launching countdowns for each other is one of the most notable examples I could tell you. Where for Trump, it's the DeSantis's kiss of death countdown that highlighted 60 days of his failures during his campaign on social media. And then in response to that, DeSantis launched a Trump accident tracker, which it did something, but it didn't do what it needed to do. So there's always a question of like what is the election strategy and like voter mobilization strategy that they need to do in order to regain those votes. But currently, a lot of DeSantis's campaign has been relocated to Iowa, which I think the numbers report about a third of his campaign, which seems like he's banking pretty hard on gaining a close second, or even if possible, like winning that bid in Iowa. I think most of these Republican candidates are thinking about getting a close second so that they can outbid Trump, but not necessarily thinking about whether or not they can get that first, especially in states like Iowa in the first couple of states. So that is basically what I have for you. It's not very extensive, but I also don't know what else I could say other than the fact that it's kind of interesting. Kind of it's like they're battling each other. They're using social media. It seems very childish at times, but also very entertaining at other times. But I'm not necessarily sure like if that does convince the voters or not, Spencer?
I think it's really interesting, like, what is happening with the DeSantis campaign at the moment. Partly because, like, I mean, a lot of, whenever we're talking about presidential elections, we always look at Iowa. It's like if it was Democrats that were trying to fight for the White House, like what they did in 2020, it was focused on Iowa. Hey, Iowa is a huge indicator about where the party really does stand and who are the people that will make it out alive. And in that case, it was Biden and Bernie Sanders as the two that basically made it out alive after, I'm pretty sure, after Nevada, where they were the last two standing by that point. I don't recall that actually totally entirely, but Iowa is a really big part, and we see a lot of campaign strategies actually shift before the Iowa primaries. And that's something to keep in mind is the reason why DeSantis is going to put a lot of eggs into Iowa is because as he's doing that, he's learning what the voters are really wanting, and his entire campaign is going to shift just for Iowa voters. Iowa drives pretty much the entire primary election cycle. In the past, and I don't mean to kind of do a ramble here real quick, you, but in the past for like Democrats, for example, that really have promoted stopping petroleum, for example. Iowa's got a lot of cornfields. And what happens is a lot of Iowa Democratic voters are very supportive of keeping petroleum. So what ends up happening is you often see right before the Iowa primaries, Democratic candidates push saying, we can keep petroleum, because they want those voters. And that tends to lead them to success. So we do see a lot of campaign strategy shift prior to Iowa. So something to keep in mind for everybody here is you might be familiar with the stuff they're saying now, but I don't exactly know when that Iowa primary is. Whenever that Iowa primary comes, you will know right away that their strategies are not what it is now.
Yeah, for sure. And, for those of you who listen to the podcast and are 18, go to your primaries. Go to those caucus meetings. It's important. Like, if you don't like either of the two candidates, go to them so that you could like say, "Hey, I actually want to voice my support for this other candidate." It's important. So like, know the dates. I guess we're not great because we don't know the dates for like Iowa, but I'm pretty sure Spencer knows the dates for Wyoming.
Do I?
I'm still, do you? I don't know.
I know.
I'm still like getting more familiar with Indiana because I'm now a registered voter in Indiana. So there's that. But I think like understanding elections is important, but understanding that it's not just about the president vote in 2024 that matters. Like if you do want a different presidential candidate than the two options you're given, go to your caucuses and go vote there. But other than that, like other elections are important too. So basically turn 18, vote, and get educated on how our election system works.
First
I
step
think,
of that process is turn 18.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, exactly. And I only preface with that because all of y'all are probably like 18 or 19 and younger. So with that being said, you have a head start. But let's also get started on the question. As we're talking about presidential bids and as we're talking about campaign strategies, Spencer, what does Ron DeSantis need to do to reinvigorate his presidential bid? And I guess we could even say like, what does his campaign need to do to reinvigorate his presidential bid?
I think it's twofold, YuYu. I think the first one, like I kind of alluded to it at the end of my background, and it is he needs to get every candidate knocked out by Iowa. Hey, and that is a tall order at this point in time. And quite frankly, with how bad it's gone, it's probably improbable that that's going to happen. So if he's really going to push his presidential bid to a chance to actually beat out former President Trump, he's got to get all of these candidates out. I mean, we did see Mike Pence drop out, but I think honestly, Chris Christie is going to be nasty to get out of this. He's going to push until he realizes he doesn't have that full support, and that's just based off of knowing Chris Christie from the several times that he has done this, right? So you're not going to really see like DeSantis be able to make this tall order happen. So on the flip side, what this has to be is better social media performance. As I alluded here, social media has been a very successful campaign strategy for the Republican Party in the past. It was successful in 2016. It certainly was successful for them in 2020. It just didn't get them to cross the finish line that year. And that was just by a little bit of poor performance by the Republican Party there. But social media needs to be a key player. And DeSantis clearly he needs to have a good vision and portray it much better to his audience. I personally think if you're going to target towards Iowa, you need to make your social media presence specific to Iowa too, and really push those voters to start getting interested in his campaign. And having that social media presence in Iowa will be very successful for Ron DeSantis as quickly as he can make it happen. Okay. I'll be totally fair. I haven't, like, generally speaking, like, because I live in Wyoming, I see a lot of Republican ads just generally when it comes to election. I haven't seen a lot for Trump and I haven't seen a lot for DeSantis. Hey, I don't know what that means for Iowan voters, but getting an early head start is much better than waiting until the last minute. Get people invested into this campaign. First off, reorganize your campaign strategy entirely and then push social media in Iowa. It's going to give him probably the best chance to knock out his other competition and be rather successful in Iowa and lead it down towards the end of the early primaries with South Carolina and it ending to be with Trump and DeSantis. That's probably his best strategy is social media presence, rebuilding it and pushing it in Iowa.
Yeah, I think that, with your point about social media, that's something that's been so important throughout past election cycles, especially recently. I'd say like the past two, having a big social media presence has contributed a lot to just who is going to win. And I think that like the reason why Trump has been leading in the polls so much is because he's in the media like constantly, whether or not that's for good press or bad press. Some of us that don't understand like some of the press that is actually bad press is bad press would just be like, oh, I see this person, like it's constantly on my feed. Yeah, I'll just vote for them because I see them. And so I think that is the reality of what that this is the reality of what we're in the 21st century with social media being super popular is who is shining bright on social media. And it doesn't even have to be a good kind of shine, right? Like if they could just have a presence. And I think like we also see this with Ramaswamy's campaign, and his like bringing to TikTok by Jake Paul or something like that. I don't think we like linked that source, but if you go on TikTok and you look up Ramaswamy and Jake Paul, like you see them buddy buddy. And you also see Jake Paul saying that like, hey, Ramaswamy is like the candidate for the youth because look at him reaching out and trying to, have a fan base on TikTok, without even considering the other political I can't say candidates, but like the other politicians that have also done similar things with their own platforms and stuff like that to get information to the public. But thinking about it that way, social media definitely has to be one of your answers for a question like this. And I'm not saying like just in this context. If DeSantis was replaced with like Nikki Haley, with Ramaswamy, with literally anybody, with Chris Christie, right? Like you would have to talk about social media as one of the things that their campaign needs to do to reinvigorate their presidential bid because it's a huge factor in how information and campaigns travel to and reach your voters and other people. I think also thinking about the reasons why Nikki Haley has had more success recently, I think just in these past weeks, in the past month, is because people have seen her campaign and seen her basically like policy focuses and I've thought that they were really straightforward and outlined. What that means, I have no idea. I am not a Republican. Spencer's not a Republican, and we don't necessarily keep up with like Republican candidacies. But in that sense, it does seem like Haley has a more streamlined platform. And while she has a past of being wishy-washy on certain policy goals, it does seem like she has a straightforward path on what she would bring to the American people as a candidate. And I think that is something DeSantis has been struggling on recently. I know his campaign has been saying, whatever Florida wanted, DeSantis gave them. But also, like, what does that mean? And what does that really look like in practice? It doesn't necessarily mean that you pass this legislation and what you wanted to happen happened. It just meant that you passed a legislation and a piece of paper is now considered legal, right? But that doesn't necessarily fly by with some of his voters and also like some of the people in Florida as well. And thinking about that, like making sure that you are able to have a straightforward path and like policy issues that you're definitely going to be focusing on is also key because then that gives voters a sense of what it is you're going to be focusing on when you're in office. And because, we know Nikki Haley, and if you don't know Nikki Haley is like the former UN ambassador for the United States under Trump's presidency. And so we know as voters that her campaign is going to be focused on international relations, really connecting like local, statewide, national to the international. And some voters like that. She's been gaining a lot of success in Iowa with that campaign. And I think like one of the sources that we have highlights how one of these people who were at one of her rallies were like, I never really thought about voting for Nikki Haley until I went to her rally. And she seemed like she had everything straightened out, knew what she was going to do when she like got into office. And it was very convincing because if you take a look at DeSantis right now, who seems to be backtracking on some of the words that he's been saying, not necessarily like outline clear policy goals, despite what he's like regardless of what he's done in Florida, it's not looking great. And he's like fallen off in popularity recently because people just aren't sure what DeSantis is doing. And so clarifying that would really help.
A topic like this really it answers the answer to it is quite simple. You have to appeal to your voters, right? Like, I mean, and that's one of the ways you do it is through social media, as we've been talking about. So, questions to think about when answering this question, right? How else is DeSantis going to appeal to his voters? How else are you going to communicate that way? I mean, you can have a rally, but how are you going to tell them about a rally, right? You're like that's one way to communicate with a voter, but having a rally also only gives you have to find a way to communicate that there's a rally, and you do that through social media. So there's one answer. The second one is through advertising. So if we were to go through multiple paths, right? How is he going to advertise? Well, you can advertise on television. Okay, TV ads do some damage. Okay? I personally think that in the past, especially what we saw in 2020, you saw two different types of video. You saw two different types of ads. You had a fiery ad, which came from the Trump campaign, and then you had an ad for hope, which came from the Biden campaign. So, what are you going to do to make your audience believe in your campaign? Do you want to throw out attacks? Do you want to throw out hope? Okay, or do you want to kind of do a little bit of both? Okay, so these are just things for extempers to think about. I'm not going to give you the answer onto that because that's a little bit more complicated. But that's one way you can try to gain attraction from your voters, which will push them to your website and to make you look at you. The other is through news interviews. And this is something I personally think a lot of the Republican candidates have failed at, is being able to get themselves into news interviews or in town halls. The only candidate that I have seen so far that has had a successful town hall has been President Trump or former President Trump. And I remember that he did a whole CNN town hall. I don't recall a lot of town halls from these other candidates. There was one that USA Today hosted a little while ago that all of the candidates took part in. They got questions and answers there. But they need to be, like, just generally speaking, the entire Republican candidates need to be involved in more of those. That way they can appeal to voters and they can attract voters for primaries. And this is, in my opinion, especially important for Governor DeSantis. At this point in time, he needs to get more news interviews. And I think that he has really struggled with this too. And I know it's really early in the campaign trail, but now is really, if you're this far behind, now is the time. It's time to catch up. Like, you can't be 40, 50 points behind, as YuYu was talking about, and not think about the end game. You have to catch up now, is kind of the way that I'm thinking about it. So how do you appeal to your voters? How are you going to attract voters? This is just simple, like, how are you going to market? I think actually this is a great time to take a marketing class, because it's literally the same thing. It's how are you marketing to your voters? Because now you're advertising yourself, and that's really what it is an advertisement of yourself onto a ballot for people to vote for you.
Not Spencer running all of you off to DECA. Um, but yeah, like I agree. I think like recognizing how you're being portrayed and recognizing what your form of outreach is. Like for some candidates, it's more personal where they like go into local communities and host town halls. For others, it's a lot more social media driven. It's a lot more clout-based driven, which means that if you already have that sort of, status to most people in America, like former President Trump does, then you have way more reach and you are like ahead already in these elections. But that doesn't mean that your position is secured. Because other candidates can do a lot of damage to your campaign. And I think we've seen that a lot for Democratic primaries. And we've also seen that a lot for like Republican candidacies, primaries that have been happening in like history.
Yeah.
So take a look at those and see what you can find. I will also say that this is a question that is asking you to give solutions, right? And not necessarily like voicing your own opinion on the matter, right? So, like, as I've said, both Spencer and I are not Republican. We do not vote Republican, right? But that doesn't mean we wouldn't answer the question the way that we've been talking about, even if it like does bolster Republican campaigns.
And I should clarify that way everybody does know, like, what your political party is does not matter when we're talking about this, and you should be able to see things from both sides, right? Because at the end of the day, like, how you do a campaign works the same way from a Democrat to a Republican, to an independent to a libertarian. You have to be able to appeal to your voters. Okay, so even if you and I were Democrat, or the occasional we're like, oh, maybe that Republican is okay kind of people, right? Even if it's like that, hey, the way it works is the same across the board. So it's the same. It's basically the same answer here every single time. It's just different based off of how you're appealing to a voter, right? It's really interesting. It's really interesting, YuYu. The third episode we've done coming back, and we have agreed 3 times. This is
I'm about to
actually
disagree. So maybe you spoke too soon. Because like I think voters are important. Like voting is important, but also like recognizing the system that we are in, electoral college wise, and recognizing that candidates don't have to appeal to all voters, but just demographics that
well.
will get them
That's what I mean. You're appealing to
yeah.
your voter base, right?
Yeah. I think that's a more accurate way to describe
Yeah.
it. But for more on that, check out our episode on the Electoral College. I don't
I,
remember what number it is, but it's some episode back.
it was a really early
Yeah.
episode.
I think
But
it was
like
season one. Season one, yeah.
but yeah, this is like really interesting. Like you and I have agreed 3 for 3. Like this doesn't really happen on this podcast often. So
Yeah.
just wait for the disagreements, because that's when that gets fun.
Maybe we should say it's not like obvious disagreements. Like there's
Yeah.
still nuance within our
Yeah.
answers. But I guess like we have more obvious disagreements.
It'll be interesting when we get the complicated questions and both you and I are like
We're like, actually, just kidding. But yeah, I think that wraps up the episode pretty nicely. And I think like talking about social media, wink wink, might or may not be in our next episode. You'll see. You'll see. It's like tech related, but it's like our international topic.
I honestly thought you were gonna be like, talk about social media. Now go follow the half hour. I mean, I
that
was
would've been
waiting for
smart.
that
Would've been
transition.
smart. But I was just gonna say, like, hey, just keep up with the news, y'all, and get the one in the round. If you don't get the one in the round, that's okay. Let us know how you did. Let us know how we did. And we do know that we haven't had like a special guest on the show quite yet. Let us know if you want those back. It's always good to have another perspective that's not just Spencer and me like ranting off on what we find online. But yeah, just let us know. And honestly, if you want to let us know who, that would also be grateful as well. So if you don't know where to do that, DM us or email us, as socials are linked somewhere around the channel. But if not, go follow us on the Half Hour Extemp podcast on Instagram and Twitter. We do a lot of polls there. You can contact us there. You can also let us know your opinions on what you think the show should do next. We will read your comments. We will take your advice. Just comment more, because we don't got comments, but follow us is the first important part. And also remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Our episodes come out there earlier than they do on the One Clap podcast. Give them a follow, give them a listen, because we love Lyle and we love One Clap. And don't forget to ring the bell when you subscribe so you are notified of when our episodes come out. With that being said, thank you all for listening. Extempers, speech debaters, and everyone else. I forgot. I didn't do that because you ruined my flow. But on to the next episode. We will see you then.
Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, we will see you all later.